Well, here we are, the main event of the evening. Signing in is thousands of photographs. We have the one and only Jim Steinfeldt, the rock photographer behind the rock and roll lens. And I'm proud to be his friend. We've known each other quite a long time. And I want you to enjoy the books. The pictures are great. And what else can I say? You know, anyway, he goes to more concerts than I do. But anyway, this is Jim, my friend, and it's a wonderful book. So enjoy it.
Thank you, Stan.
Just great.
Thank you for coming, everyone. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank Stan Behrens, the legendary musician, for introducing me. As you probably know, Stan's had an illustrious career, certainly best known as a harmonica player. But Stan, why don't you shout out some of the other instruments that you play have played professionally for all these years?
Well, I played harmonica, of course. Everybody's heard me play. I played all those TV shows. I play saxophones and flutes also. And I had a career of working with people like Ruth Brown, Jimmy Smith, won 3 Jimmy Smith records. I worked with Willie Dixon for 7 years.
Doesn't he look kind of young to have worked with Willie Dixon? I mean, how can this be?
He was a baby. There's a painting somewhere.
I was always the youngest kid in the band,
Yes.
and now I'm the old guy. I'm currently playing in the band War.
Yes, Stan is playing in the band War, singing some of the parts.
No, I do. I play harmonica
Playing the
in the horn
harmonica.
section.
Yeah. But you sang some of the parts when you were with Canned Heat.
Oh, I did. In the movie The Bucket List,
Yes.
when they go into Mount Everest, that song On the Road Again is playing.
Yes.
That's me singing and playing.
Right on.
It would be great if I got paid.
Furthermore, Stan wrote one of the great stories in my newest book, Rock and Roll Lens,
That was when I was working with Bo Diddley.
Volume 2, and he wrote the story about Bo Diddley.
Yeah.
And there are other people here who I'm going to mention in a minute who also wrote stories in this book. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to thank the wonderful people here at Diesel, a bookstore, who helped put this evening together. I'd like to thank Mo and Alex. Alex just introduced Stan. I'd like to thank Diane. I'd certainly like to thank the owner of the store, Allison. But most especially, I'd like to thank Cheryl, who set up this specific event today. And so I thank the bookstore, Diesel, a bookstore. I also want to thank Leica cameras, which I'm videotaping filming. I don't know what word to use anymore. Filming in this day and age. And by the way, anybody who wants to shoot some video or shoot some stills, I'd be thrilled for you to do that. And you can send them to me, and perhaps I'll post them. Obviously, you can post them if you wish.
Tag us.
Alex mentioned that I'll be signing books after my comments here this evening. I'll be signing them in the bookstore. And so my only little sales pitch on the books are simply this. The newest book, the paperback, is $19.95 and is available in the bookstore. And my first book, which is a number of years old now, although the brand new copies, it retails for $50, but it's for sale for you guys today, $35. The beautiful hardcover book with color photographs. So let me talk a little bit about the photographs that appear in these two books. By the way, is the sound okay? Is this about right? Okay.
Perfect.
Well, the first book, Rock and Roll Lens, we can call it Volume 1, even though it doesn't say so. When I wrote it, I didn't know there was going to be a Volume 2. It's really a biography. It's an autobiography written, obviously, by me about my career as a rock and roll photographer. And I'm going to hit on a few highlights of my career here tonight. But frankly, I tell the whole story in this book, if you're interested. What I did is, first I had to choose my 50 favorite photos, which was not easy to do because I've taken probably around 250,000 photographs. You can imagine that. Wow. Kodak made out very well on that project. So I picked my 50 favorite photos. Now, I've probably photographed about 3,000 concerts. And about 100 photos per concert. That comes out to, is that right? No, it would be, so whoever can do the math. It comes out to, yeah.
30,000.
Okay, very good. So it comes out to about 250,000 photos somehow or another. But in any event, so then I wrote a fun, most of the stories are funny, and I'll read a couple. I wrote a story about each picture in the book, and I'm going to start with this picture here of Tina Turner. And it's one of my earliest photographs. A lot of the photos in this first book were shot in Minneapolis, which is where I started my career. And that was fortuitous because I was there in the 80s, and Prince was, he was already famous, but he became more famous because soon after I photographed him the first time, he released the movie Purple Rain. So Minneapolis was a good place to start one's career as a rock and roll photographer. And I went on to photograph many bands that came from there. Some of the names you would recognize would be The Replacements, Husker Du, Soul Asylum, and The Time, Morris Day, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who eventually moved here to Los Angeles and produced all those legendary artists such as Janet Jackson, and worked with Michael and well, many, many people. So that was a good place to start in Minneapolis. And let's see, the story about Tina Turner, if I can find it here. I photographed her at First Avenue. I photographed a lot of people at First Avenue, which is a famous nightclub in Minneapolis. I would compare it in a way to the Troubadour here. It's larger than the Troubadour. It's actually kind of laid out like the Palladium, but much smaller. There's a big balcony upstairs, which was a great place to take photos from, because you could be out of the patron's way and still get great photographs. So at First Avenue, I photographed Tina Turner in 1985. Okay, and here's the little story I wrote. The record labels, indie radio promotion companies, and others saw me at many shows, including Tina Turner. And Tina, of course, began her amazing career with the comeback with the Private Dancer tour. What's Love Got to Do With It became Tina's first #1 hit in the United States. She soon went on to a successful stage and film career, as we all know. But this was her comeback, really her comeback tour. This was the Private Dancer tour. I will say parenthetically that all the pictures in this book, my first book, all the color photos, are available as limited edition prints, and I brought one tonight to show you what they look like. Shall I read you a funny story?
Yeah, funny story.
Okay. So this is one of my favorite stories, and it goes like this. I took Jean, one of my models. You see, I also have done fashion photography throughout my career. And so Eric Clapton was coming to town, and I decided to invite Jean, a model whose portfolio I did, take her to the show. On the way to the show, she told me how excited she was because she loved Tom Petty. We're going to see Eric Clapton, I explained. She says, Eric Clapton, Tom Petty, same thing. Well, she was pretty young. She didn't know anything about Eric Clapton and his amazing career. So I kind of gave her a short history lesson as we drove to the show. Now, we had excellent concert seats, and after I had photographed the first 3 songs of the show, up front by the stage, I returned to our seats, but Jean wasn't there. After the show was over and nearly everyone had left the venue, Here struts Jean from backstage. Here's your backstage pass, Jimmy. She said, follow me, she said to me. Turned out, during the show, the whole band had been checking her out. We were close to the stage. And their tour manager hooked her up with passes. So in the end, it was Jean who introduced me to Eric Clapton. Because even though I was, had the permission to photograph the show, that didn't get me backstage. That backstage pass that Jean got me backstage. So the moral of the story is, bring a pretty girl to the concert. I'll read another story, and then I'll tell you about the next book. Here's a fun story. And I'll show you this picture, too. This is a picture of Guns N' Roses. And this is in their heyday, I believe in 1987. Oh, and by the way, when this book was in galleys before it was printed, I got a hold of Slash of Guns N' Roses, and he autographed the galleys for me. So when I printed the book, his autograph appears in every copy of this first edition book, in which he said, "Hey Jimmy, thanks for the careful photo placement in your gorgeous book. You're fantastic." Right? Thank you, Slash, wherever you are. And the reason he said, "Thank you for the photo placement in your book," well, on one side, the page before is my photograph of Les Paul, who of course, invented, if you will, maybe along with Leo Fender, also invented guitars. Les Paul invented the electric guitar, and that's the guitar that Slash is synonymous for playing. But on the other side of Slash's picture is my picture of Bob Dylan. And I'll tell you a little story about that picture. So Slash liked being between Bob Dylan and Les Paul. So I wanted to meet Bob Dylan, as many people have wanted to do for a long time. And I'd almost met him many, many times previous, because I photographed him in concert many, many times over the years. And as a matter of fact, when I would photograph him, I would make a beautiful print and I would give it to Bob Dylan's mother, because I knew Bob Dylan's mother, lovely woman, Beattie, and she was friends with my mother and my grandmother. We're all from Minnesota. So that was kind of fun, but I would always miss by a few minutes backstage meeting her son, the great Bob Dylan, until one day I was in Rochester, Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic's there. That's not why we were there. He was doing a concert there, and I was backstage, and that was my chance. And I walked up to him, and I gave him a print, in fact, a copy of the picture that's in this book. And Bob Dylan took that picture, and he looked at it. The first thing he said to me was, "That's a good picture." So I just about fainted. And but I kept my composure, because I had another copy of that picture with me, and I asked him to sign it, and he did. And of course, that is a very special possession of mine. Now I'm going to talk about the new book. This is the newest book, and here's why it's different than my first book. Number one, it's paperback, and it's smaller, so it's less expensive. I wanted my work to be seen by as many people as possible, and I felt that the second book, I could do that. I could make it more affordable. But I also, I think artists try to do something new each time out of the box. And I decided that's not enough just to make it paperback. I'll put only black and white photos. So this is some of my best black and white photography. And then I thought, one of the cool things about my first book was the stories. You just heard some of the funny stories that I wrote. But I said, I've kind of told all of my favorite stories, and I've told my biography in this book. So I started calling friends of mine in the entertainment business. Hey, could you write a little story about the 50 people in this book? And, well, number one, the man who introduced me this evening, Stan Behrens, he wrote the story about Bo Diddley. And it's a very funny story. I might have Stan come up later and read it. Or come up now. Break up the monotony of Jimmy just going on and on. And then I'll tell you about some other great writers who contributed to this book who happen to be with us this evening. So let's see, Bo Diddley, we gotta find the page. And it's on page 31. And okay, here we go. So Stan's going to read to you the story. Yeah, would you like to? Oh, I'll tell you what, it's kind of, do you want to just read the edited version?
Well, let's
You lived it.
I know I did. It says I worked with Bo a couple of times. We first met when I was working with Willie Dixon. I was at the show when Willie was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame at the Guitar Center. Later during the premiere of the Hall of Fame, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, in the lobby of the Chinese Theater, there was a poster-sized picture of Bo. And I'm not going to read it. What happened was my brother was working on the premiere, and when they cleaned up everything, this big picture of Bo Diddley was kind of left behind. So my brother picked it up, and he put it in the trunk of his car, and he brought it back to my house. So like about a week later, I had a gig with Bo. So I brought this picture with me, and I said, Bo, sign it. And he looks at it and he goes, that picture is mine. I said, well, it's of you, but it's mine. He said, no. And he's grabbing it and everything. And I go, no, this picture belongs to me. I just want you to sign it. He goes, I'm not going to sign it. So Willie Dixon's standing right next to him, and he goes, hey, Bo, sign it. So once Willie Dixon spoke, everybody listened. So I got this beautiful poster-sized picture of Bo Diddley, hand-signed from Bo Diddley, Rock On, 1987. And it hangs in my living room. But that was the thing. But we played a few gigs together. He's kind of an angry man. Well, I don't blame him because Arc Music publishing company, they ripped him off for all his royalties. And they did the same thing with Willie Dixon, but Willie had a different attitude. He felt that he was making like $75 a week, and he's writing all these hit songs for Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. But he was getting paid steadily, and he was able to afford to keep his family going. He later on in life, he won back all his royalties. I met him back in 1986 or 87, and when he heard me play harmonica, Willie said to me, the first time he heard me play, he said, hey man, you've been playing that thing a long time. I said, really? What makes you say that? He said, you got the tone. He says, you can't get that tone unless you've been playing a long time. And he wrote down his phone number, and he says, you're welcome to come to my house anytime you like. And from that day on, Willie became my best friend. And I was with him right up until he died in 1992. He was the nicest guy I ever met. Anyway, that's my story.
Another person who wrote a great story in my book is with us here tonight, Greg Richland. Would you like to read your story or paraphrase it?
I'll paraphrase.
Do you want to come up here?
Sure, why not? Yeah. I don't know that I want to follow a Willie Dixon story, though.
A little introduction on Greg. Greg's a legendary bass player, and I'm going to let him tell you some of the legendary artists that he's played with and bands that he's been part of from the get-go.
All right. Hey, everybody. Yes. I don't know, Wallflowers, Macy Gray, Fiona Apple, Michael Penn, Joe Henry, those are a few names. Recently, though, moved back into the film industry, but still connected to music. So yeah, I wrote the story. Jimmy kindly asked me to write the story on Fiona, who I met when she was 17. I was making the second Wallflowers record in Santa Monica, and our manager busted through the door one day and said, "You got to come out to the car and you got to hear something." I said, "Okay." So we sit in his Mustang and he pops a cassette. You know what that is, right? Yeah. 3-song piano vocal demo of this girl, Fiona Apple. And I sat and listened to it, and it was incredible. And he said, "What do you think?" I said, "This is amazing. Did she write the words?" And he said, "Yeah, she wrote everything." He said, "She's never played with anyone. She's just sits in her room, plays piano, and sings." And I was blown away. I said, "Wow, that's really a find." And I said, "Where did you find her?" He said, "The babysitter gave it to Catherine Shanker, Sting's manager, who then handed the tape to Andy because she thought this is pretty special." So I said, "Wow, she's phenomenal." And he said, "Great, you're going to go in the studio next week with her." So, oh, okay. So myself and Lou Reed's drummer, Danny Frankel, you know Danny? And Patrick Warren, who was Michael Penn's keyboard player. We all met at that little studio in Santa Monica, 4th Street Recording. It's like a little tiny studio. I think it used to be the Beach Boys studio. And her father was there the whole time in the control room. I think he was like an old Sesame Street actor, kind of a character actor from New York. But of course she was young and a bunch of guys in the studio. I'm sure he wanted to stick around as long as he had to. And so we just, she'd never played with anyone before, so it was sort of an interesting dynamic of, we weren't going to tell her, "Hey, no, lay off the left hand, let the bass hand." We kind of reconstructed and rethought how we were going to work with someone who had really just been, alone playing and writing songs for a handful of years. And I think that approach kind of created something kind of unique, right? Because you circle around somebody as they were doing their parts as opposed to trying to link up, because it was very off the cuff. And I think they tried to beat some of those demos for a long time, and they finally just said, "You know what, this has a special something to it, and even though it's not perfect, it's honest." And it was an amazing experience, to sit there. She handed out handwritten lyrics, which I'm sort of like reading Shadow Boxer, and so like, honey, going, "Wow, this is, how old are you?" This is really amazing. So they tried to beat it. I remember being called back in the studio about 6 months later to try and work on the 6th version of Shadow Boxer, which got cammed as well. And they just kind of, left it warts and all. Sort of a little bit of like a Crazy Horse approach, I think, right? It's sort of, before they, figured out the part, Neil's like, "We got it." And then, "Wait, hold on." But my mistakes, is like, "No, it's good." So it was a great experience, and I think that it set the tone for a career that most know. She kind of follows the beat of her own drummer, puts records out when she has 10 songs she likes, and doesn't really play the game. She still works, but I'm proud to be a part of that, and happy you asked me to write the story. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for that wonderful reminiscence.
All right.
And you mentioned Neil Young.
Yes.
And there's Neil on the back of this book. And Neil Young is in this book
right.
also, with a story written about him. Now, I know one other person is here who wrote a great story, a story about Alice Cooper. Raise your hand if you wrote a story about Alice Cooper. Michael? Didn't you?
Perhaps. I'm not going to raise my hand.
Do you want to make a comment, or I can?
No, you can read it.
All right, very good. The great, my good friend, the great Michael Levine, is here with us. And he wrote a wonderful story in this book too, and I'll read it for you. If I can find the page. Could have marked it in advance. Page 35. Okay, here we go. So Mike, here's my picture of Alice Cooper, pretty outrageous, screaming madman with his wild makeup. And so here's the story. This is Michael Levine's words. My company did PR for Alice Cooper. He is known for introducing certain aspects of horror movies and vaudeville into rock and roll. I first saw him at the Academy of Music in New York around 1971, where he performed with a guillotine and fake blood. No one had ever brought forward to rock and roll music, a stage show that featured a guillotine, electric chair, boa constrictor, and the cutting off of dolls' heads. This was very, very unusual. Michael goes on, Michael goes on that and says, Alice Cooper was born in Detroit and had been touring around the music industry for years, but his big success began in the early 70s when he introduced the stage show to his career. And Michael goes on about his famous tour manager, Shep Gordon, and Michael, apparently that was a very important concert or experience in your long career in the rock and roll music business. Thank you for that story. I want to thank everybody for being here. I'll tell you what I'd like to do. I'd like to now entertain or try and answer any questions you might have. So let's see if anybody might have a question or two for me. Oh, yes, hello.